Welcome, everyone, to our December annual tea and membership meeting. My name is Anat Bar Cohen. I'm the president of Generations After. And I first want to take a moment to thank you all, so many of you who have sent us your expressions of caring and concern at the recent passing of my beloved husband, Professor Avram Bar Cohen, Zichrono Livracha. My family and I thank you from the bottom of our hearts. And now I invite you to settle down with your cup of tea and your kichel or babka or sufganiya in the spirit of Chanukah, and help us create a virtual version of the warm atmosphere we create every fall at this annual event. Before we start the program, and as the first part of the membership meeting, I'm going to deliver a very short President's report of the accomplishments and challenges Generations After faced in this past year. I don't think I have to say that this has been a particularly difficult year for everyone around the world. But despite the isolation, the losses, the lack of in-person connections, we have continued to offer programs, virtual gatherings, educational projects, and financial support to organizations that aid our cherished survivors. Our multi-generational family continues to foster the legacy and memory of those impacted by the Shoah. Our active book group discusses books from the perspective of a shared history. Last year, we met numerous times and expanded our online participation to a range of 25 to 45 people. Last month, 3 members presented memoirs they themselves had published. Our writing group has met in 3 6-week sessions and has produced moving memoir pieces. We are about to form and start a second group this month. Remember a Child, a living memorial project, continues to match B'nai Mitzvah children with children who were murdered in the Holocaust. In non-pandemic years, we had been serving upwards of 60 children and families a year. Last year, due to the closure of synagogues and B'nai Mitzvah postponements, we served 15. This was among the great challenges to the Jewish community and to our program. During last fall's membership tea, we heard 3G Czech filmmaker Lukáš Pribal discuss his award-winning documentary, Forgotten Transports. Our move to Zoom programming brought us a stimulating discussion with acclaimed 2G author Helen Epstein on several of her and her mother's books. And we had a filmmaker discussion of the Canadian documentary, Will the Second Generation Please Rise? In May, we helped plan and participate in the virtual community-wide Yom HaShoah commemoration, an event in which we've been involved for many years. Our 2019 member survey guided the focus of this afternoon's program on anti-Semitism in America. The survey that we took last year also requested that we enhance our communications. And so we've been sending out our e-newsletters every month on our programs and those of other Holocaust-related organizations. We have over 550 people now on our mailing list, which has grown considerably over this past year. And before the end of this year, we'll launch a new and more user-friendly website. Financially, we balanced our income and expenses despite substantial reduction in donations from Remember a Child, but it was offset by an increase in paid membership of over 60%, and we thank you so much for that. Turning to Zoom programming and developing our new website added new costs for technological support, but we did gain more participants and members from around the country. As part of our core commitment to tzedakah for survivors, we were also able to contribute $2,500 this year to Blue Card, an outstanding survivor support organization that offers direct aid to over 3,000 households of needy survivors in 35 states in this past year. Those needs have grown substantially during the pandemic. All of these activities are funded by your membership dues and donations to our Remember a Child program and by other donations. Thank you to those who become new members or renewed this year. As we launch our new website, we'll be sending you a quick and easy way to join if you have not yet, or to renew. Many programs and projects are planned for 2021 on topics such as researching our family histories, documenting 2G stories, and working on the struggle against anti-Semitism. Let us know what is important to you and we will try to reflect that in upcoming programs. We look forward to serving you and to your continued engagement. So as an introduction to today's program, we're honored to have a video greeting from Sara Bloomfield, Executive Director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Ms. Bloomfield.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the Generations After group. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today, but I'm glad to be sharing some greetings, and so glad that my colleague Rob Williams will be participating in your program, and frankly that you're focusing on such an important topic of anti-Semitism. And it's kind of astounding to think that here we are in the 21st century and that the problem surfaces again and again, and of course is known to be violent in the last few years, and even here in the United States, something I think most of us thought we would never see in our lifetimes. And of course, it shows that even in the aftermath of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism was not defeated. And I frankly think that if you look at history, well before the Holocaust, it's dangerous to assume that it is a disease that can be eradicated. There's no doubt it's a human disease. But I think history is a reminder that this disease will come back and back and back. If you look at how versatile it is, how resilient, how it adapts itself to different religious beliefs, different political systems, different cultures, it always finds its way when certain things are present. And here we are, even in our great democracy that is being challenged by it. I think the other thing about that we know from anti-Semitism and history is that in times of crisis, it always spikes, and that Jews have been such a convenient scapegoat for whether you're on the far left or the far right or wherever your beliefs are. Somehow you can very easily throughout history find a way to blame the Jews. So what does it mean for all of us? Well, for us at the museum, it means we have to really double down and do a much better job of not only Holocaust education, but explaining the key role of anti-Semitism historically that led up to the Holocaust and that was throughout Europe, and frankly, even throughout America during the same time period. So we have to really enhance our educational efforts and focus not only just on that the Holocaust happened, but how and why, and of course, reach newer generations. But what worries me about when I look around at the country and the world is that history education is on the decline. History majors are down more than any other. And I think you all know that the study of the humanities is also been declining. So I worry about that we're not preparing young people with the study of history, not just Holocaust history, but history in general, because history gives you a framework for thinking about the present and the future. And I hope makes people more critical thinkers about their own role in society. And the last thing that really worries me, and I think makes a very dangerous combination with the decline in history, is the rise of social media. And you all know about that and the dangers of that. So the topic that you're going to discuss couldn't be more important or more urgent for our times. And I hope that you have a very fruitful discussion. Thank you for having me.
Our thanks to Sara Bloomfield for her insights on the critically important topic that we will be discussing today. My name is Dina Hirsch, and I'm Vice President of the Generations After. The theme for our panel this afternoon came directly from our members' responses to our Generations After survey in the summer of 2019. You identified anti-Semitism as your #1 concern. The relevance and importance of this issue has only increased since that time. As the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors who fought in the resistance, I can only imagine the horror with which they would view the resurgence of anti-Semitism throughout the world, including the United States, and the alarm with which our cherished living survivors must be viewing it today. We, as their progeny, must do more than view it. We must take steps to fight it. The late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks once wrote that, quote, Hanukkah tells us not to curse the darkness, but instead to bring light to the world. It teaches us to fight back and not be afraid. This is the attitude that we must bring to the darkness of anti-Semitism. During our panel discussion, we encourage you to write your questions in the chat. As time permits, our moderator will pose your questions to the panelists. We will also keep a record of your comments to help inform our board regarding the direction our organization should take regarding this devastating reality of anti-Semitism. We will be posting a recording of this program on YouTube and provide a link for all of you. There is one change to our panel today. Unfortunately, Rabbi Lauren Holtzblatt is unable to be with us this afternoon. We are delighted, however, that Rabbi ABBI SHAROFSKY was able to join us in her place. And now it is my honor to introduce the moderator, Dr. Robert Williams, Deputy Director for International Affairs at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and Chair of the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial at the 34-Nation International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Robert is also a member of the steering committee of the German government's Global Task Force on Holocaust Distortion and advises several international bodies on issues related to Holocaust remembrance and anti-Semitism. He is currently overseeing a major international initiative that assesses European Holocaust and genocide denial laws. Among Robert's research specialties is contemporary anti-Semitism. Outside of work, he is co-editing a volume for Routledge on the history of anti-Semitism. Please welcome Dr. Robert Williams.
Thank you, Dina, and thank you, Anat, Micheline, and really the entire Generations After board for inviting us to speak today. Our goal today is to provide everyone with a sense of the challenges posed by the resurgence, I would actually say the intensification of anti-Semitism as we're seeing it today. Our hope is that the conversation will provide you, the second generation of survivors, with some ideas and some signposts for ways to enhance your engagement in pushing back against this, the oldest hatred. By the end of our talk, I'm hoping we all have a stronger sense of at least three core features unique to anti-Semitism. First, it's certainly growing, but it's also adaptable and remarkably persistent. Second, anti-Semitism is not unique to any one culture, any one politics, any one society, any one religion. It has multiple ideological, cultural, and religious influences. Finally, most important of all, anti-Semitism is a threat to real people. It's a threat to our core institutions, to our shared international beliefs, and to our democratic way of life. In short, it is a critical problem that needs to be fought across society. And it's on the rise. Let's start in Europe, where for all intents and purposes, anti-Semitism began and where it reached its most violent ends in the Holocaust. Several EU surveys demonstrate a very sad day-to-day reality. 20% of EU Jews in a recent EU-led poll reported family members or friends had been subject to either verbal or physical attack. More disturbing than that, a significant majority, close to 80%, do not go to the police to report these crimes, often because they feel it won't change anything. Police statistics are even more disheartening. Now, over the 10 years between 2009 and 2019, it's important to note that in some European countries, anti-Semitism did fall. These were countries like Belgium and France. But in most countries, though, anti-Semitism increased. Sometimes over that 10 years, the upward swing was relatively modest, like in Sweden, where it rose by 11%, or Germany by 20%. But in other countries, the upward trajectory was frightening. Austria, 150%, Greece, 100%, Denmark, 292%, with a 96% increase just between 2018 and 2019. And this is sad, but it's not just a problem over there, it's a problem we have here. And if we look at the United States, we need to realize that we're not immune to these trends. Yes, historically, we avoided much of the violent anti-Semitism of the European experience. There were a few outliers, such as General Grant's attempt in 1862 to remove the Jews from my home state of Kentucky. There's also the 1915 lynching of Leo Frank in the state of Georgia at the height of the lynching scourge that claimed thousands of African American lives. But by and large, anti-Semitism was a more generalized hatred that had begun to fall into decline by about the 1960s. The situation is no longer like that. It is characterized now by a growing number of violent attacks on Jewish communities and Jewish individuals across the United States, beginning right around the Overland Park shootings in 2014. In 2019, the most recent year for which we have FBI statistics, crimes against Jews represented 60.2% of all religious-based hate crimes in the US. This is how the FBI classifies anti-Semitism. This was an increase of 14% since 2018, the year of the 11 murders at the Tree of Life Synagogue. Even still, the problem's likely worse than this because any agency, and I imagine Seth will talk about this in a few moments, will note that statistics are often underreported. And in the US, of the 15,588 law enforcement agencies that work with the FBI, only 2,172 reported hate crimes of any kind to the Bureau. So how did we get here? And what can we do? These are questions that the panel is going to seek to explore today. Each of our panelists is going to look at these present-day challenges from their own unique perspectives. First, we have Seth Gordon-LIPKIN. Seth is the Education Director in ADL's Washington, D.C. office, where he oversees education programs throughout the DMV and North Carolina. These include anti-bias education programs for K-12 audiences, programs for recognizing and confronting anti-Semitism, and Holocaust education initiatives. Before joining the Anti-Defamation League, Seth was a program associate for BBYO in Northern Virginia. He has an MBA in nonprofit management from IU's Kelley School of Business and a master's degree in Jewish education from Hebrew College. Our second panelist is Rabbi Abby SHAROFSKY. Rabbi SHAROFSKY is the Jewish Community Relations Council Director of Intergroup Relations, the JCRC Rabbi in Residence. Ordained in 2012 at the Jewish Theological Seminary, she also holds a master's degree from JTS, specializing in experiential Jewish education. Rabbi SHAROFSKY serves as Deputy Director of the Jewish Welfare Board, Jewish Chaplains Council, where she worked with Jewish military personnel and veterans. Rabbi SHAROFSKY received the 2016 JPRO Network Young Professional Award for her dedication to the Jewish community through her work in the Jewish and not-for-profit field. She's a Rabbi Without Borders Fellow and currently serves on the Executive Council of the Rabbinical Assembly. Last but not least is ELAD STROHMAYER, the spokesperson for the Embassy of Israel here in DC. ELAD joined the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2010 and has had postings in Angola and Philadelphia, as well as served as a desk officer in the North American division of the Israeli MFA, focusing on Canada and US-Israeli relations, as well as special projects in North America. He was in this capacity until 2018 when he assumed his current position in Washington. I'm going to turn it over to each panelist to ask them to make a few opening remarks, after which the four of us are going to engage in some conversation to address some key concerns and some possible solutions. After some discussion, we're going to try to incorporate your questions. We ask you to submit these through the chat function on Zoom, and also please remember to keep your microphones on mute. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Seth to be our first speaker. So, Seth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. I'm going to enable a screen share very quickly for a short presentation. And I want to thank you very much for having me and all of these other esteemed panelists and our moderator for what is unfortunately a really timely but critical discussion about understanding anti-Semitism in the US and around the world today. I want to talk a little bit about understanding anti-Semitism and some dynamics surrounding bias and bigotry more broadly. But first, I want to just talk a little bit about ADL, the organization I work for, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We were founded really in response to the lynching of Leo Frank in the early 1900s outside of Atlanta. And we were founded with this mission to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment for all. Over the last 107 years, ADL has become one of the nation's leading anti-hate organizations, and especially in terms of understanding and responding to anti-Semitism, that is really ADL's expertise. And we have been able over the decades to develop some really reliable and important data to understand attitudes towards the Jewish community around the US and throughout the globe. And just last year, we put out an updated survey of attitudes towards Jewish people in the United States. And the findings of that survey were that overall, the attitudes towards the Jewish community in the US are overwhelmingly positive, with 2 out of every 3 US adults generally saying that their feelings towards Jewish people in their community and around the country are warm or positive, with only 7% saying that they feel negatively cold towards Jews. But despite that overarching good news, we are still able to see that there is widespread ignorance and lack of understanding around anti-Semitic stereotypes and tropes, with nearly 40% of US adults saying that they believe anti-Semitic statements, things like Jews have too much control of financial institutions, Jews are not as loyal to the US as to Israel, that 40% of American adults believe multiple anti-Semitic statements to be true. But similarly encouragingly is that only about 11% of American adults, we would say, really harbor anti-Semitic attitudes, believing the majority of anti-Semitic tropes and themes to be true. And that overall is an incredible trend that has moved in the right direction over the decades, with this being the lowest number of US adults believing a majority of anti-Semitic statements to be true. But we are not seeing this necessarily borne out in the way that anti-Semitism is impacting the lives of American Jews. Over the last 3 years, ADL has tracked an enormous surge in the number of anti-Semitic incidents taking place throughout the country. Anti-Semitic incidents falling into the categories of harassment, vandalism, and assault. And what you can see in this chart, the left-hand side, is that in 2017, we saw the single biggest increase in anti-Semitic incidents year over year in the 40 plus years that ADL has been gathering this data, with 2019 representing the single highest raw number of anti-Semitic incidents taking place in the United States. So we know that while attitudes are not aligning with action, that there is still this elevated level of anti-Semitic attitudes actually being used to target Jewish individuals throughout the country. And that is something that we've seen borne out in the FBI hate crimes data, not only about hate crimes motivated by anti-Semitism, but hate crimes across the board, which have risen to the highest level in over a decade. And we know that these are things that people are encountering every single day online, especially. More than half of American adults say that they've experienced some form of harassment online, with just over a third of US adults saying that they've experienced severe harassment online. That's more than a doubling of a similar study conducted by the Pew Research Center just a few years ago in this report from ADL's Center on Technology and Society. And that online harassment is similarly to hate crimes, targeting people based on their identities, marginalized identity groups or otherwise, whether they are LGBT, Muslim, if these are racially motivated, etc. And they are happening across all platforms, but really Facebook represents one of the single most common places to encounter hate and misinformation online and harassment. And what we hear from the public is that not only is this impacting their lives online, but they believe that this is making hate crimes more common. And of course, the FBI data does bear out that expectation, that understanding of how this rhetoric and culture of harassment online impacts people in their lives outside of the internet as well. And that's something ADL has tracked. So I mentioned that 11% of US adults, we would say, are the virulent anti-Semites, the people who it is a part of their everyday ideology. And those are people who are more emboldened than they have been perhaps at any point in US history. ADL's Center on Extremism and has this resource called the heat map that you can see on your screen. It's an interactive resource online. And this shows where we track incidents of hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, and domestic terrorism throughout the United States. And you can see that these are really heightened levels in pockets throughout the country. And there is a feeling, an emboldenment among organized hate groups and other extremists to that they see a mainstreaming of these kinds of beliefs and a feeling that there is an acceptance of acting out on them. And that's why we are seeing such an elevated trend of anti-Semitic incidents taking place and other hate crimes. And we also know that data only gets us so far in understanding this, not only because of the collection issues that Dr. Williams mentioned previously, but also the issue that a lot of this data is relied on through self-reporting by the targets or the victims themselves. And the Jewish community has generally positive relationships and a sense of trust with law enforcement, which is not present in a lot of other minority communities. So while we do see this trend that we can quantify within the Jewish community, we expect that there are similar trends that are unrecorded in other communities as well. And so what ADL is trying to do about this, investigation and research, monitoring domestic extremist and organized hate groups throughout the United States, educating and training children as young as kindergarten and everywhere up to college campuses, law enforcement agencies and others to understand bias and recognize and respond to it. And then finally, advocacy and assistance to targets of anti-Semitism and other forms of hate themselves. With that, I apologize that I'm a little over my time. I will turn it back over to you, Dr. Williams.
Thank you, Seth, and please just call me Rob. I'm from the
Okay.
South. There's no need to be formal. I'm going to turn it next to Rabbi SHAROFSKY for her opening comments. Rabbi.
Hi, and also you can, Rabbi Abby is fine. If you can go by Rob, I can go by Rabbi Abby. So thank you everyone for having me here. It's an honor to be speaking with this group and to be part of this panel. And it's great to follow Seth and the amazing work that ADL is doing. JCRC works closely with ADL on many things. They hear about what's going on. We come in and sometimes assist. And it's a wonderful relationship to be able to have both professionally and to know that there are partners in the field, people that are taking on this work, because unfortunately there is so much of it. So I'm not bringing statistics. I'm a rabbi and I like to tell stories. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the stories and the relationships that I've encountered over the last year and what they mean in terms of understanding anti-Semitism and how we can move through it. So 1 year ago during Hanukkah, we were hearing about the attacks on Jews in New York and New Jersey. We were hearing about a rabbi's house in Muncie, about things happening in Jersey City, and that Jews of many different kinds throughout New York City and elsewhere were feeling threatened. So what did we do? We organized, and there was a march in New York City in early January. And I look back at the pictures entitled, "Just Me and a few thousand of my closest friends marching across the Brooklyn Bridge, standing in solidarity against hate." Because that's what we were doing. We were there, we were showing up, we were saying that this is not okay, we're not going to stand for it. And it wasn't just Jews that were marching. As I looked around at the people around me, it was people of all colors, shapes, sizes, ages, demographics saying this is not okay. And not only do I need to be here as an adult, I need my children to see that what's happening isn't okay. And I'm very proud that I was on one of the buses that left from this area, from the greater Washington area, where almost 150 people from this area woke up at the crack of dawn to get to New York City, driving both ways in the same day to show that we care about the communities of Jews throughout our country. After we came back from New York, a few weeks later, I was honored to speak at John Wesley AME Zion Church in Washington, D.C., a predominantly Black church located in the U Street area. And I was brought in by their pastor, Pastor Dr. Chris Zacharias, who said, "Rabbi, it's not okay that these things are happening. And can you come in and talk to us about anti-Semitism? Because the Black community and the Jewish community, we need to stand together in this. It's not okay." So I did. And I stood there at his pulpit and was able to address a crowd that Sunday morning, that were there to hear about church and there to hear the words from their minister, and were able to give me a resounding amen when I said that it was not okay that my child is understanding, that my child is experiencing racism, that my child is experiencing anti-Semitism, that as I looked out at a room full of people and looked in the face of one woman saying, you know, I won't have to explain to my child. I never thought that I would have to explain to my child about anti-Semitism as you have had to explain to your children about racism. And I know you understand this pain. And I know you understand this. And together we can say that this is not okay. And we stood together. And when I walked at the end of the service, a 90-year-old woman with a grip that I hope one day, God willing, I could have at that point in life, said, "Rabbi, this is not good. And we got to stand together. We did once upon a time, and we need to continue to do it." And so the year went on. That was only January. In February, we had we heard that Chinese Americans and people in the Chinese community around the country were being targeted. They were being attacked and being the focus of violent xenophobia and bigotry that were aimed at them because of this new virus that had arrived on the shores of the US. And the JCRC, along with our parent organization, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, began a letter writing campaign to Chinese organizations throughout the area. I wrote to the Chinese Community Center of Montgomery County, the Chinese Chamber of Commerce in our area, and said, "We're here, we stand with you. You stood with us when our JCCs and our schools were experiencing bomb threats, and we want you to know that we see this is not okay, and we're speaking up and we're speaking out." Later in February, I was invited with several other members of the Jewish community to be representatives at the Chinese embassy and to meet with the Chinese ambassador, and for the Jewish community and the Chinese community to come together and say, we're standing up against hatred. We're standing up against bigotry, against scapegoating. And from that meeting, a Chinese philanthropist, as our area started to hit the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, and PPE was in short supply, our area was blessed by a Chinese philanthropist donating very generously PPE to Jewish organizations and others throughout Montgomery County, but especially making sure that it got to the JFGH, the Hebrew Home, JESA, places where our frontline workers and people in our community desperately needed it. That's our network, and that's the power of the relationships. So I want to make sure that I stay within the time. Do I have one more minute, Robert, or am I one more minute? Okay. And how are we doing this? Beyond these grand gestures, we're also looking at the day-to-day education. We have programs like Student to Student, like our Lador Vador program that many of the I recognize some of the survivors who have participated in that program. And one of the mixed blessings of this pandemic is that we've been able to morph our student-to-student program to also include interfaith dialogue. And what does interfaith dialogue do for teenagers? Well, it's not just about talking about Judaism or talking about another religion. It's having a chance for teens to be honest with each other, for teens to talk about what they struggle with within their religions and make it real. And education is the front line. that's where we can do that's where we're doing the real work, because this is taught. You don't grow up hating people. You aren't born hating people. It's something that you're taught. And if we can teach this now, if we can teach that hatred is not okay, if we can teach what Judaism is and teach against anti-Semitism now, then we're preventing another generation of hatred. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Rabbi Abby. ELAD, can you share your thoughts and the perspective both of the Israeli government and Israeli society about what's happening over here? How are people perceiving these changes?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor. Thank you, Anat, Dina, and especially my friend Ruth for allowing me to participate in such an important panel. It's a very dark subject, not to be so delicate, but I'm a hopeful and optimistic person. So we said that everybody has a cup of tea. So my cup of tea is with a heart and a rainbow heart, because I believe that we need to spread the love eventually, because that's the best way to combat anti-Semitism. And I'm an optimistic myself. I want to share a little bit my perspective, and then I'll talk about the government, what can be done in that perspective. Rob, you mentioned the Leo Frank case, so it takes me back to my undergrad studies in university. I studied political science, but I wrote one of my final papers about anti-Semitism, because back then I worked at the Jewish Agency, and I knew how important it is to me to tackle this topic. I chose the Leo Frank case because it was very interesting for me. I'm a descendant of the Baileys, of the family of Baileys, from the famous Baileys blood libel in Russia. And I remember the stories as a kid, and my grandmother even knew his mother, so it was a family thing. And for me, it was fascinating when I learned more that around the same time that Baileys was accused in Russia, in Tsar Russia, that was not considered a democracy by no mean whatsoever, a court of law found him not guilty, and he was free eventually, despite all the attempts to throw this blood libel on him. At the same time that happened in Russia, there was the Leo Frank case in United States of America, a liberal modern democracy, and Leo Frank was found guilty and was executed by a mob. And that was fascinating to me. How does that happen? And I'm not sure I have an answer until today, because hatred is much more complicated. And it brings me to when we talk about anti-Semitism and when we look about how to tackle anti-Semitism, there are many ways to define anti-Semitism. There are many ways to categorize anti-Semitism. There is the classical anti-Semitism, the hatred towards Jews, and then there is maybe the more modern day of it, of white supremacy. There is also anti-Semitism coming from Muslim groups, which is interesting because anti-Semitism, Semite, it's not just the Jews, but we see Jew hatred from also Muslim groups, unfortunately. And there is also anti-Semitism that we find from the radical left. Sometimes these people I'm not even familiar that they're using anti-Semitic rhetoric. And that brings me to the next level of what I want to say is that when I look at modern anti-Semitism, I think it's anti-Semitism that is directed not necessarily as Judaism as a faith, but at Judaism as people. So the classic anti-Semitism from different faiths, it's definitely against the Jewish faith. And this is what we saw also in the blood libels, for example. But today, the modern day one, anti-Semitism, also target us as people. And I think when we talk about our connection, the fact that you chose to bring a representative of the state of Israel to this panel is the understanding that something unites us, and this is this peoplehood, this common history. It's not just our religion. Our religion entails our history, our language, our custom. It's much more than that. It's peoplehood. And that's also the idea of Israel, the idea that there is a homeland for the Jewish people. So eventually, that brings me to the question then, how can we discuss the difference between criticizing Israel and saying that this criticism, when is this criticism, is anti-Semitism. And this is something that we need to tackle, and it's not an easy one. It's not an easy one because not every critical opinion towards the state of Israel, I think it's anti-Semitism, but where do we draw the line? And I think in this definition of modern anti-Semitism that target us as people, this is where the problem lies, and we need to tackle that. We need to tackle all these types of anti-Semitism, and the way to do that, and I'll stop here, is by working together as communities, like we heard from Rabbi Abby and from Seth, but also working together as countries and as in international communities. And further on in the panel, I might elaborate more on that. Thank you.
Thank you, ELAD. We're going to discuss a lot of what was said. There are a number of very important points made. As a reminder to the audience, two things. If you have questions, please share them via the chat. Then somebody from the generations after will curate those and send them to me. And also, please mute your microphones when not speaking. So, with that, I think maybe I'm gonna touch upon something that ELAD said at the very end, but actually ask Rabbi Abby to be our first person to answer this. What do you understand by the term anti-Semitism today? You know, is it something that you just feel? Is it something you know when you see it? If it looks like a duck, it sounds like a duck, it might be an anti-Semite, that type of approach? Or do you feel that there's a need for something a little more concrete and formulaic to begin to address this problem, especially from the educational side? So Rabbi, let's start with you, and then Seth or ELAD can jump in afterward.
So it's I go with the, if it looks like a duck and it sounds like a duck, it's probably an anti-Semite. That's kind of where I am. There's something about, it's like you feel it in like your kishkas when you know that it's wrong. The interesting piece is so often the and I saw this in one of the data points that Seth brought. 40% of Americans are saying these anti-Semitic tropes, and I'm wondering how many are even realizing that they're anti-Semitic. And for me, I think that's the learning piece, is helping people understand that when you say something that is stereotypical, it doesn't seem like it's hurtful, or, oh, it's just something I've always heard, so I assumed that it's okay. Actually, it's not. I had an opportunity to talk this through with a colleague, a woman from a Baptist church, Christian educator is her title at the church. And she kept talking about the Pharisees. And I said, Brenda, we respect each other. And I want to tell you that when you say the Pharisees, what you're talking about are rabbinic Jews. You're talking about people like me. And she stopped and she said, I never thought about it that way. And she came back to it months later, and she said, the way that you told me made it so that I could hear you. You didn't make me feel bad about it. You didn't chastise me. And I learned something, and I've been able to speak up against that in my church too. So thank you. And I think when we have more moments like that, we're able to push back against anti-Semitism.
ELAD or Seth?
Yeah, so we have a fairly straightforward definition of anti-Semitism, which is that anti-Semitism is the marginalization or oppression of Jewish people on the grounds that they are Jewish. Now, I think dissecting that further, the way that ELAD talked about of being able to sort of identify anti-Semitism that is hatred of the Jewish faith versus hatred of Jewish peoplehood or cultural Jewish identity, and then of course anti-Israel bias and hatred of the state of Israel. These are all sort of individual streams of the same hatred, in a sense, and really how it relies on age-old stereotypes and myths. I think it's very important in understanding the way anti-Semitism manifests that a lot of the kind of anti-Semitism we encounter in our lives is rooted in ignorance rather than malice. But if we were to sort of define it in just the simplest terms, it is targeted marginalization of Jewish people solely because of their belonging to that identity group.
And I can relate exactly to these points. I think what Seth said right now is very important, because sometimes people behave in an anti-Semitic way or express anti-Semitic opinions or thoughts. And I don't think they even do that on purpose. I don't think they even understand, some of them, not all of them, they even understand that this is anti-Semitic. And this is the distinction, if someone is doing it on purpose or not on purpose. Now, I cannot judge sometimes what the motive behind a person's statement or not, but this is how we need to combat that. We need to be delicate, and we need to understand, try and understand where the person is coming from, and educate and work with them. And I agree that it's in your kishkes. It's very difficult to determine. Us Israelis, we're very cynical. We like to joke about everything. So I don't think the Jewish faith is beyond mocking and joking about. It's fine to joke about us as well. But when joking about us becomes anti-Semitic, and I think the definition is eventually you just know it, you just feel it. And a lot of people do that without even meaning to do that. And we need to work with that. That's important. That's if we're just going to attack them, we're going to alienate them.
So you brought up the issue of motive, and I think each of you touched upon that to a degree, and you're right. You know, it's hard to understand what's in the heart and mind of another individual when they say or draw or write something. But by understanding anti-Semitism, you can at least begin a conversation with that person and say, hey, that image you're using is anti-Semitic. Do you know why? And then you can dig a little deeper, and maybe 1 out of every 50, 1 out of every 100 individuals will change their thinking on a subject, and that could be progress. Does the term matter? We have a question from the audience saying, pointing out there are some individuals who say, we just need to stop saying anti-Semitism. It's a term invented in 1871 by a German anti-Semite. We should call it anti-Jewish racism or anti-Judaism, or there's a whole panoply of terms. Does that matter? Is that the fight we should be having today? Because this is popping up in the press from time to time.
Can I take this one, Robert? So I think this is an important question, and I want to defend the term anti-Semitism for a moment. Because it was created by that this German person, particularly created to define his hatred towards Jews. Now, where I think there is an important understanding that ADL has really chosen, that we elected not to write anti-Semitism with a hyphen. That is something that we made a conscious decision about because of that history recently. And because including that hyphen almost muddies the understanding of anti-Semitism. If this term is really meant as hatred towards Jewish people on the grounds that they are Jewish, then having that hyphen almost creates, a confusion around who is a Semite. Now, there is no real such thing as Semitic peoples, only Semitic languages. And that's something that I think is really important to this, and having no hyphen there sort of eliminates the ambiguity around who this form of hatred is specifically targeting. And because I noticed that it was part of the phrasing of the question, I think calling it anti-Jewish racism also muddies the waters, because racism, is a social construct, something that that varies from society to society. Or society to society, excuse me. In the United States, racism is a system built on white skin versus non-white skin. And so to try and apply an understanding of Jews who come from all different races in the American sense of the word would just sort of create further ambiguity. So I think anti-Semitism without the hyphen is kind of our best term, but your mileage may vary.
And I think that trying to divert the conversation to maybe we should use a different term is trying to divert the issue and the problem itself. And I'll say something provocative. The swastika is not a symbol that was invented by the Nazis. It's an Hindu symbol that symbolizes something totally different. There are beautiful paintings with the swastika. But it doesn't matter. Nobody makes this conversation today because the swastika symbolizes something different today, whether we like it or not. And this is the reality. If we're going to start saying, oh, what the Nazis, they use that, and let's use now the swastika for different purposes, I think we're behind that. And that's also with the term anti-Semitism, even if there is a valid point of saying otherwise. But I actually agree also with Seth, his reasonings as well.
Well, I'm going to pivot to a new topic, actually, and it's an important one that I'm seeing come up in the comments a little bit. So we all know that times of strife make bad situations worse. We also know that through history, my doctorate's in history, so actually in media, the history of media. We also know that too much information also makes things worse. So we are in an environment right now where on the one hand, we have the challenges of online anti-Semitism. On the other hand, we are in the very real situation of the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And a number of us, specific to the pandemic, are seeing 7 or 8 new anti-Semitic conspiracies linking Jews to the virus in one way or another. Rabbi Abby, I want to start with you. Is your community experiencing the stresses of anti-Semitism more or less in light of the pandemic and the online debates? How is this shaking out within your community and from a religious perspective as well?
So it's a great question. I can say what I've heard from colleagues around the country and the sort of manifestations of anti-Semitism that have come out in the form of Zoom bombings, people that have had these targeted targeted attacks on Jewish communities that, while they're not physical, are certainly emotional and psychologically traumatic. So there are issues like that. I'm also seeing, when everything went virtual with schools, and schools is a main space where JCRC focuses with education, and we get the reports, well, there was an incident at a high school or a middle school, there were swastikas, or there was anti-Semitic graffiti somewhere. Well, we're not in the schools to be able to see the anti-Semitic graffiti, but what's happening in the chat spaces, what's happening in the Zoom classrooms. And we don't have those data points yet. It doesn't mean that it isn't happening. It just means that, and this is something that we've been asking the different school districts, how are you upholding your policies? How are you making sure to make sure that the religious diversity guidelines and the guidelines on harassment and bullying that include religious-based harassment as a form of bullying, are you making sure that that's being upheld during this time of virtual learning? So it's taking steps like that to make sure that kids are protected. And as well as, sharing with our communities when someone reports like, oh, we were Zoom bombed. Well, are you following ADL's recommendations on how to safeguard your Zoom spaces, your virtual spaces? How can we connect them to the different secure community network representatives who can help them go through the right paths to connect with the FBI and report these as hate crimes, because they are. So those are the things that I'm seeing and that I'm hearing about from colleagues around the country and in our community here.
So to turn it, actually, maybe I'll start with ELAD, because a lot of the online challenges that we're seeing aren't just coming from within the United States. They're coming from these international networks of hate groups. There was this 14-year-old kid who was running a neo-Nazi network out of Estonia that had people members in North America. I know Israel, because I work with your government on a few of these issues from time to time, is very heavily engaged in tracking and monitoring of these movements as they exist online. But what can be done to kind of push back against them, and especially given, as Rabbi Abby said, that so many of the students are living in an online space at the moment? Are there any new programs, any new approaches? And Seth, I know ADL has some perspectives on this as well.
I think when we talk about online hate and online anti-Semitism, the problem with social media and online reality today is that it's an amplifier of a situation that we're all familiar with. I can only say, let's imagine what would have happened if we had social media in the 30s. It would have been maybe even worse. I don't know if it can be any worse, but the problem is that social media is amplifying the trends that are ongoing on waves, like you said, Robin, in your opening remarks. And this is very important. This is why we need to tackle it. Now, I think there are the technological ways of tackling it, because a lot of these networks, a lot of these organizations are in the dark web, that people like us are not exposed to even. You need to be very special and very familiar with where to go to find these conspiracy theories. And then after you have the technological intel, you need to start targeting the people who are working there. And this is working together as governments and working together, the Israeli intelligence with other foreign intelligence and organizations here, and working together with the community to find these people and to target them. And we see that every time there is a lone shooter, he's influenced or because of these social media. And I think it's scary because we don't know what our kids, when they're sitting in front of the computer, what they're exposed to. So it's a mix of reaction. It's working together on technological and intel and tackle those leaders. Not easy, but it's being done. But then it brings to exactly what Abby said, working on education and enabling the safe environment and the awareness. So I think despite the fact, by the way, that we have an amplifier today that is horrible by social media, we don't see that all hell broke loose yet, because the awareness is much higher, because there are organizations like ABBI, like the JCRC, and I'm naming those two because they're here, but there's so many that are doing educational work. So it's easier maybe to control that, but we have a lot to do still.
In addition to that, I mean, there is this important task of monitoring the people that are focused on spreading hate and misinformation online. But there's also, and that's something ADL and plenty of law enforcement agencies and government entities are focused on. But there's also a responsibility upon the social media platforms themselves that allow hate to run rampant on those platforms. And in many situations, on Facebook especially, profit enormously from the boosting of those kinds of posts, through their algorithms and through the ad revenue that they drive. And so that's one of the things that ADL is really focused on in partnership with groups like the NAACP to try and help advertisers understand the impact of their dollars on the spread of hate on platforms like Facebook, and trying to encourage those companies to pause their advertising on Facebook until the platform makes substantial and important changes to the way that they allow hate and disinformation to spread unchecked.
And just to add to what Seth said, I was talking about mainly about the dark web and these networks, but actually Seth also mentions Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So the Israeli government is very active, has a very active dialogue with those companies to make sure that these things are being tackled. It's one thing, and I agree with Seth, that we need to work with the advertisers, that they'll make it clear to the platforms, but we are also working directly with the platforms in Israel because they have offices in Israel, but also through our missions, mainly in San Francisco, where all the headquarters are, and to make sure that this is being given an answer. Do that with Facebook, Twitter. Facebook is also Instagram, TikTok, Pinterest, etc.
The Israeli Democratic Institute just actually issued a series of guidelines that were created in cooperation with your government and with Yad Vashem and a few others on ways to address this online. So, for the generations after group, as you're trying to identify ways to move forward, it might be worth looking at those recommendations because they're quite strong. I'm looking at the clock and I'm being besieged by questions, which is great to see, but we only have so much time. So I'm going to try to summarize, make a summary question here. I think we're all in agreement that something negative clicked. I think it clicked 5, 6, 7 years ago. But again, I'm mostly focused on Europe and looking at the changes in France. But even in the United States, something changed 4 or 5 years ago as well. Seth, in his comments, noted a significant change in statistical indicators around 2017. Even over the course of a longer period of time, we've seen an enormous rise of hate groups, both of the left and of the right across the United States, many of which are animated, at least in part, by anti-Semitism. So something's changed. But at the same time, we're also at the period where we've had decades of investment in various educational initiatives that can, at least we dreamt, would help combat some of these trends and sustain a more peaceable society. And maybe that just hasn't, it's proven to be not quite enough by itself. So what do the three of you suggest we do to move ahead? And do you see a particular role for the second, third, and fourth generation of survivors to play in pushing back against this? Because I know there's a lot of desire to participate and a lot of desire to help inform these developments. So I will we'll start with the order of the speakers. So Seth, Rabbi Abby, and then ELAD to wrap that up.
So I think, and I'm bringing this up because of this group and the importance of the second and third generation in this effort. I think one of the biggest challenges in raising awareness around anti-Semitism in our society is this challenge that people outside the Jewish community especially almost exclusively understand anti-Semitism through the lens of the Holocaust. They expect it to look like it did then, and therefore the way that we do see anti-Semitism manifest either is not necessarily seen as an urgent threat or even necessarily understood as anti-Semitism. So I think one of the things that's really critical is helping to help people to see the history of anti-Semitism in the thousands of years before the Holocaust and the persistence of anti-Semitism in the years and decades since the Holocaust. That rather than thinking of anti-Semitism as a chapter within the book about the Holocaust, thinking of the inverse of the Holocaust as the most significant chapter in the longer history of anti-Semitism, and helping people to be able to understand the way that these manifestations of anti-Semitism we see in our society today, in many ways are old wine in new bottles. The same myths, stereotypes, and tropes recycled with new boogeymen, new scapegoats to apply to a new era.
Okay, so my role as Director of Intergroup Relations means that I spend a lot of time, in fact, most of my time, working with people who are not Jewish, outside of the Jewish community. And the thing that I realize the most in how we talk about anti-Semitism and how we move forward, as I see it, is through allyship. It's not just about what's happening and how are we protecting ourselves, which is of course important, but it's also it's that other piece of Rabbi Hillel's Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that, you know, if we're only for ourselves, what are we? So I bring the example of when the Jewish community was pushing to make sure that we had days off in the school calendar for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we didn't do it just for the Jewish community. We brought along the Muslim community to make sure that Eid had a day off. We brought along the Hindu community and Sikh community to make sure that Diwali was being recognized. And we said, this takes all of us. This takes the Jewish community, the Muslim community, the Hindu community, all the Asian American community to recognize Lunar New Year. We are in this together. We're stronger together as we do this. And we need to make sure that we're not only doing this so that our kids are getting off for a holiday. And in doing that, it not only made sure that, and it passed. We now in Northern Virginia, you have in Prince William County, in Arlington County, and we're working our way through Fairfax County. It's on the record and will, God willing, go through very soon. But we did this together, and now you have a whole community. Loudoun just passed it. Whoa, cool. I just saw that in the chat. And we now have a whole community of people of all different faiths who are recognizing that there's so much power when we come together and we stand together and we fight bias together.
So to answer your question, Rob, I can basically say whatever Seth and Rabbi Abby said and take it to the international level between countries, because this is what we do as a country. You mentioned about the second and the third generation. I'm a third generation of Holocaust survivor, and there is the term never forget. But the problem is that as time will go by, we will never forget, but it's going to be a piece of history. Still today, it's very much alive. And then the question is, how do we maintain the importance of it with the notion that people won't have the close connection to it and the emotional connection of what we have. And that encompasses that anti-Semitism is not just the Holocaust. The Holocaust is a very dark chapter of anti-Semitism. And that brings me exactly to what Israel has been promoting on the international level that more and more countries will adopt is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And I think it's very important that countries take a definition of anti-Semitism and accept it. And that is a framework for cooperation between governments, between countries to combat anti-Semitism. I think what SETH and what Rabbi ABBI has described is amazing, and it's done in the community level. And we need to see that all over. And we do that with cooperation between governments, and that's extremely, extremely important. And the state of Israel is pushing for that, along with the United States, with the State Department, with our other allies, and also organizations. I know, Rob, that you're very much involved in that as well, and nonprofit. So it's working together on that on the international level. All the methods and systems that everybody before me described, but taking it to the international level, that's the best way to combat that.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you, actually. I think to wrap things up and to hopefully make everyone feel a little bit better, I don't think that this is the new normal. I don't think any of us think that this is necessarily the new normal, but it is a changed time. And there are positive steps. You know, ELAD mentions the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's anti-Semitism definition. The fact that this has been adopted by about 29 countries. 2 of those countries are Muslim majority countries. So there is already progress being made. Leaders around the world, civil society, I work in Europe too much, NGOs around the world are also talking about anti-Semitism more and more. And it's beginning to reintegrate into the human rights discussions that we're having. It's not perfect. There are still very, very real, very significant challenges. But the fact that these conversations are happening is important. And I think we all agree that there's an important role for the descendants of survivors to play in this struggle. With that, I hand it back to the board, and thank you for your time.
As co-chair with Micheline Amir of the program committee, I want to thank our educated panel, SETH Gordon-LIPKIN, Rabbi ABBI SHAROFSKY, ELAD STROHMAYER, and our dynamic and knowledgeable moderator, Robert Williams, for this powerful and thought-provoking hour on the crucial topic of anti-Semitism in America. You've also given Generations After a springboard for strategically joining this important battle. Thank you to the program committee for your dedicated and hard work in creating this program, and to Ephraim Katzir for his technical assistance. Thank you to the attentive and engaged audience for joining and participating with us. If you're a Generations After paid member, please stay on for the next 10 minutes while we conduct our 2020 elections for board members and officers. Happy Hanukkah, everybody.
Before we move into our elections, we thought it's actually the time, so maybe we will light some candles. So if anyone has a Chanukiah nearby, feel free to join. And unmute yourselves so we can say the bracha together. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher nishchanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehainu Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam שעשה ניסים לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה. Amen. I think it'll be too hard to sing Maos Tzur together, but Chag Sameach, everybody. And Susan, we're going to move on to you.
Chag Sameach, happy Hanukkah.
Sameach.
Happy Hanukkah, everyone.
Okay, well, thank you, Anat and Ruth. What an incredible afternoon. I want to, before we move on to the elections, thank one of our outgoing members, Charlotte Siegel, for her years of service on the board. In particular, we thank her for her dedication to maintaining and growing our Generation After Book Club for the past several years, and are thrilled that she'll continue in that role. Thank you so much, Charlotte. On your screen, you will see a list of the board members who are up for election. You have already received their names and bios by email. Since there were no additional names put forward from the membership, we will vote by acclamation for this slate of board members. Please unmute yourselves now.
Yeah.
All those in favor of adopting this slate of candidates, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, please say no. Well, the ayes have it, so we are happy to accept this slate of board members for the 2024 period. The slate of officers is Anat Bar-Cohen, President, Dina Hirsch, Vice President, Ruth Cummings, Secretary, and Simon Schnerman, Treasurer. All in favor of adopting this slate of officers, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. The ayes have it, so congratulations to our officers who will serve a 2-year term.
That's it.
Thank you to all who were members and voted with us. We so appreciate your support of the generations after. Good evening. Have a wonderful Hanukkah.
Thank you. Happy Hanukkah to
Happy
everyone.
Hanukkah, everybody.
Happy
Hanukkah.
Hanukkah.
Wonderful term.
Thank you for lighting the candles with us. That was nice.
Very nice.
Simon.
Hi.
Hi, Charlotte.
Hi, Annette.
Hi, Susan.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Annette.
Tina, Susan, Olympia, Louise, Simon, Shelley.
Hey, everybody.
Happy Hanukkah,
Happy
Steve,
Hanukkah. Hi,
Shelley.
Steve.
Shelley, Sarah.
Hi, Louise.
Thank you. And happy Hanukkah to everybody.
Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
Hi, Jim. Good to see you.
Hi, Tim.
Hi,
everyone.
Tim.
Hi, Olympia.
How are you
Hi,
doing?
Olympia.
Hello.
Nice seeing you
Sabina?
guys.
Yes. Hi, how are
Hi.
you? Hi.
I don't recognize you with the mask.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Yes, have a great evening. Happy
Night,
Hanukkah.
everyone.
Happy
Hanukkah.
Yeah.
Happy Hanukkah, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nora
Bye.
or not, I like that.
Who else is here? Let's see. Oh, there's still quite a bit. Let's see.
Yeah,
Who else?
If I end this, you'll all fall off the screen. You guys go first. You guys go first.
No,
Hi,
the screen goes
Jeannie.
empty.
Okay, some people are muted. All right, well, I guess I'll say bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, I'm afraid I'm gonna pull the plug.
Hi.
Bye.
Somebody has to do it.
Shalosh, arba. Ending. Litraot.